We started a series, The Story of God, finding our place in His story, last week, beginning in Genesis chapter 1, page 1 of the Bible. And the story begins in Genesis 1 with God taking an unordered, chaotic, uninhabitable place and creating order in a flourishing world that has potential. And He places His images, His royal image bearers in this creation with the task of moving everything forward, creating a world, reflecting His wisdom out into, and His goodness out into the world. And so hopeful. But we're here today at this time when we know it, thinking about then and now, it hasn't all worked out that way, has it? Because we know the story too well, because we moved from Genesis 1 to Genesis 2 to Genesis 3, and we know everything just goes all wrong. It didn't have to, but it goes all wrong. And the story we're going to talk about today in Genesis 3, it's not just a story we can read about in the Bible about, what our forebears, Adam and Eve, did, and we suffer the consequences, because this is our story too. Their decision has become sort of a template for humanity's decision all along the way. Because we can preempt, this is not in my notes, so I hope this doesn't fall flat on its face. I'm going to preempt the end. Last week I said when you get up in the morning and before you get dressed and when you still have sleep in your eye and you're looking in the mirror, you tell yourself that I am God's image bearer. And I'm tasked to go and be that image in the world. That's our core identity. But this week there's two choices we have. We can go out into the world with clenched fists. That's the stance of taking. We'll deceive Eve as taking something. Or we can go out into the world with open palms. That's the stance of giving. So that's our choice. That's our choice. That was their choice. We know what choice Eve made, and we know what choice that we have made too. And so this story has gone south. This story that's so hopeful in Genesis 1 and then Genesis 2, and then it all goes wrong in Genesis chapter 3. And so humans are God's royal image bearers. We're given the vocation. This is our vocation. From the very beginning, God's intention, God's hope, God's purpose of ruling with Him as His partners. God's wonderful creation and moving the creation forward, moving everything forward, building a world, which includes building families and communities that fully trust and are open and transparent, building a world where goodness continues to increase, and righteousness and peace and love and all of that. Well, we've built a world, but it's not characterized by those things. We come to chapter 2, we see that God creates a garden and puts man in the garden. Verse 15, He said, we're going to add to this image here. We're going to add to this image, and I'm already behind in my slides. This is where we're going. This is where the story is going. All right, we've finished part 1. We're down to point 2, which is chapters 3, primarily, through 11, failure to launch. That's the title of the lesson, failure to launch, all right? And then God works out His plan to get His original creation project back on track. And we're trying to follow the storyline of the Bible to see how that comes about and what that means for us now and in the future. So in chapter 2, verse 15, it says that God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and to keep it. Now, it sounds like till it's like become a gardener, but those words actually are words that are used in other places in the Old Testament to refer to the work of priests. The work of priests. And so we can add to this image of who we are. We are, priest has something about our vocation. So we're image bearers. That's who we are in our core identity. But we're also these royal image bearers. Don't want to forget the idea of royal image bearers. As His priests. We're royal image bearing priests. That's a mouthful. Anyway, so to rule and serve as royal priests, humans were given a choice. And that's part of God's love and dignity and being a partner with God, is that we have a choice. We have a choice. Humans were faced with a choice. Are they going to build a world fully trusting in God and in God's ways? Are they going to let God define for them what is good and what is not good? Are humans going to let God define what is good and evil, or are they going to, sing a new song, I did it my way? We know the choice that was made, don't we? The choice they made. They just said, no, we want to define what's good and evil. We want to do it on our own. But that's the same choice that we have made. That's our choice as well. So I quote our good friend Tim Mackey in the Story of God, the study notes. He says this, and I think it's worth for you to look at. I could just read it, but it's better, I think, if you can read along with me. And so he's going to be preparing us for chapter 3. All right, here a dark, mysterious character enters the story. It represents evil at its source. You think about that for a moment. It represents evil at its source. And it entices and deceives the humans to doubt God's generosity and to rebel. And this leads to disaster. Humanity's relationship with God is broken. Humanity's relationship with themselves and with their families and their communities, I will add, is broken. And humanity's relationship with creation is broken. And from here on out, most of what we see emerge out of this brokenness is violence and more violence. That's not just the biblical story, because we see it in the first section in Genesis 3 through 11, this ever-increasing violence. But nothing really has changed. Since Jesus came, everything's changed, but nothing really has changed. We look out into our world today, and we see violence. We see violence among nations. We're seeing violence in communities. We're seeing violence in homes, and even we can be violent to ourselves. So humans were given the task to build a world, but the world humans have built is broken from top to bottom. And so it looks all bleak. Because the problem is we can't do anything about it. We unleashed, our forebears and us unleashed this chaos into the world, and it cannot be undone. When you spill something, you can't unspill it. And so, but God, in this text here, God gives us an anchor point. He gives us an anchor point to hold on to. From this text, we don't know exactly what this means, but it's a signpost that points the way out of this mess that we got ourselves into. And so we're going to look at chapter 2 and chapter 3 this morning. And if we want to break it down, it looks something like this. I don't know how well you can read that. This, how I've outlined it, that's not my outline actually, but this is a common structure in the Bible. Bible writers use this structure. There's a name for this. It's a literary device to help readers to make more sense of the text, to try to understand what is being said. Because in Bible reading, it's not just what is said, but how it is said that is significant. And so generally in a structure like this, the thing that's in the middle, which is D, point D, is the most important, or the focal point. It's the fulcrum over which this whole text revolves. And we can see in the middle of this whole story, this sordid story, is the humans eat from the tree. All right. So I'm going to sort of walk through this morning a bit. So the garden is the place where humans and God dwell together. They walk together, because later we're going to see that God was walking in the cool of the garden. God and humans walking together. There was this, I guess we can say, a perfect relationship. But it's the place where God and humanity dwelt together. And so there is, in this picture, there is flourishing. In chapter 2, there is flourishing life, and there is harmony in all aspects with humans in God, humans in one another, and humans in creation. And God makes humans to take care of the garden as its priest. That's chapter 2, verse 15. We said that already. And God gives. See, God gives. God's palms are open. God gives. And when God gives, humans are blessed. Flourishing follows when God gives. And that's God's nature. God always gives. God gives, in chapter 2, gives the fruit of every tree in the garden. Every tree in the garden for food. It's all yours. Enjoy. But he says, there's one tree in the center of the garden. Don't eat the fruit from that tree. Don't even touch it. It's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's a deadly tree. So in your best interest, stay away from that. You know? Your best interest. Don't put your finger in the light socket. In your best interest, don't do that. Stay away from that. So the tree reminds them that God has given them a choice. That is the choice. Either they can fulfill their vocation, as we unpacked a bit from chapter 1, as royal image-bearing priest, by reflecting God's wisdom out into the creation, or the choice can be reject God's wisdom, reject God's definition of good and evil, what is good and not good, and instead redefine it, define it on our own terms. So that they partner with God, relying on His wisdom to extend God's goodness and creation's goodness, or are they going to say, we've got a better idea? So we come to end of page 2 of the Bible, chapter 2 of the Bible, with the humans ready to begin this task. So what could go wrong? What could go wrong? So chapter 3, enter the serpent. Chapter 3, we're going to read 1 through 7. Now the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, did God say, you shall not eat from any tree in the garden? The woman said to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden. But God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you will die. The serpent said to the woman, you won't die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband, who was right there with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. So A and B, everything's good. And so enter the serpent in chapter 3. And so the serpent talks to the woman. He has a dialogue with her. And it says in chapter 3, verse 1, the serpent was more crafty, or more shrewd, or more clever. This word crafty is a word that's found often in the wisdom writings, like in Proverbs. It's a wisdom word. It's a word related to wisdom. So this serpent is a wise creature. He's crafty. He's shrewd. Now, the word crafty or shrewd it's more of a neutral term. It can be negative or positive. All right? It can be negative or positive. So the serpent was the most crafty of all the wild animals that God made. So the serpent it's a chaos creature, because Its sole purpose is to unleash chaos, unchecked, out into the world again. And so the way to do that focuses on these humans. So the serpent is a chaos creature, and so it symbolizes everything that is not good. Symbolizes sin, death, chaos, darkness, ugliness, everything that is not good. And so the serpent, yes, is a wise creature, but the serpent chooses to use its cleverness for evil intentions. So he has this dialogue, and he offers her an alternative story. So now there's going to be another story in the story of God, an alternative story. You know, the story of God begins with God creating humans, putting humans in his creation, this good creation that says, let's build something together, wonderful and good, and let's extend that out into creation, trusting in me and what I say is right and how we are to do this. But the serpent introduces another story, an alternative story, a counter story. It is a story that it's very appealing, and it looks right. Sounds right. It appeals to us because she sees the tree and the fruit and everything was delight to the eyes. It probably tastes good, and yes, it will give something to me that I don't have, and I can't have any other way unless I take it, you see. And so his deception, the serpent's deception, is an alternative story. You will not die. God said, you touch this or eat this, you will die. The serpent says, no, you will not die. And humans believed that. What is the serpent trying to do? He's trying to undermine God's character. He's telling the woman, God does not have your best interest at heart, your ultimate interest in mind. God is holding back on you. He's withholding the ultimate good so that you can't become like him. And you know you want to be like him, and you deserve to be like him. Sounds so convincing. So it says, the woman saw this fruit. And she says, yeah, you make sense. And so she reached up and she took the fruit. Now, when you take, what you do is you grasp, you create a fist. You take what is really yours and you want it. You see and you take. That's what she did. She saw, can't read that. And the white writing there is red. I don't know why it didn't come out red, but the woman saw and took. Saw and took, those two words, just keep that in your mind, saw and took. And we look at this story and we say, oh, how could she do this? Everything was good around her. All she had to do was trust God. Why did she saw and take? But you know what? Just turn around and look at yourself. Have we done that? This is our story. This is our story. It's not just her story that happened a long time ago. And this combination of seeing and taking becomes a template for the sordid history of humanity. This is our template for building the world, but building it our way. How has that gone for us? And we don't have to get very far in the scripture. In chapter 6 and verse 2, we'll go through some of these quickly, because that phrase, seeing and taking, is found over and over and over again in the scripture. Seeing and taking in chapter 6 and verse 2 talks about the sons of God saw these daughters of men. They saw that they were fair, and they took wives. They saw and they took wives from themselves, and that was a bad thing, because it leads to the flood. And then chapter 12, verse 14 and 15, story of Abraham and Sarah. When Abram enters the promised land, he wasn't there long, and he went to Egypt. And in Egypt, it says Abram entered Egypt. The Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful, his wife, and so they took her and put her in Pharaoh's harem. And then later in chapter 16, in the story of Hagar, God had promised Abraham and Sarah that they would have a seed, a promise. God promised that. But they were old and childless, and so they decided to take matters into their own hands. And so Sarah said, hey, here's my handmaid, Hagar, you go have a child with her. And so Abram says, sure. And so he does, and then that creates all sorts of problems because Hagar looked on contempt with her mistress. And so it says that Abram took Hagar, or Sarah took Hagar, saw and took. And then in the end of this, in verse 6, it says, your slave girl, because she's all upset, Sarah's all upset, she's blaming Abram. Your slave girl is in your power. Do her to her as you please. He's saying there, do what is good in your sight. Redefining good and evil. Do what is good in your sight. And then we can go on. And the scripture that was read this morning is the background to it, at least according to the superscription in that Psalm 51, is about David and Bathsheba. If we read in 2 Samuel chapter 11, we see that David was on his rooftop and he saw Bathsheba, and then he takes her. And we know that sordid story and the consequences of that. And we can multiply this over and over again. This is a cute little innocent boy. That's me. Hey, how come you laughed? I guess cuteness is in the eye of the beholder. Anyway, this is me. I don't know, I was about 10. But the story I'm going to share is I was a little bit younger than this. So what can a cute little, innocent little boy, what can he do wrong? When I was 6 or 7, my aunt used to take my sister and I to school with her kids. And this day she dropped by a small Foursquare, a shop like Foursquare. And she says, David, could you go in and get me a box of Cracker Jacks, which is a candy. It's like popcorn that has syrup on it. Very tasty anyway. She wanted me to get that. She says, and could you charge it to my account? Now, she knew the owner. I knew the owner. His name was Harold. He worked in the store there. And so I said, sure, Aunt Jetty, I'll go do that. And so I go inside. I had no idea what charging meant. And I was too scared to ask. And so what I did, I saw the Cracker Jack box, and I took it. And I went out of the store and back to the car and gave it to my aunt. Didn't pay for it. Didn't say anything about charging it. So this little innocent little boy, at that young age, there's this bent within us. We see and we take. We want to see and we take. Now that may be innocent as a young 6 or 7-year-old, but it's this template that we have lived our life by. We want the good life, don't we? We know what's right. We want to do it our way, and so we see and we take it, but we find out that no, it's not good after all. So both the man and the woman, they take matters in their own hands, and they derailed God's creation project. That's what happened. They derailed it. They rejected God's wisdom, God's authority. They did not trust God, and so they rebelled because they wanted to find wisdom, or they wanted to redefine good and evil. So we've done A, B, C, or D. D is the central part, the fulcrum. Everything changes now. Everything is different from now on out. So now God talks with the humans in verses 8 through 13. And so they immediately were shamed. And they tried to cover their shame. Then God comes walking in the garden, but this time they try to hide. That's a new thing. They never even thought about that before. They tried to hide. They cannot be transparent anymore. There was something different. But they cannot hide from God. You cannot hide from God. And so God confronts them about their new reality, and the blame game starts. And so it's the woman you gave her, and Eve says, no, it's the serpent. So it's the blame game. Instead of owning up, it's the blame game. So the man throws the woman under the bus, and the woman throws the serpent under the bus. And so what does God do? God laments. God laments in verses 9 through 13 is a lament. It's poetry here. It's a lament. And so he speaks to the serpent, and he speaks to the woman, and he speaks to the man, and he's saying, everything's different now. It's all different. And so God curses the serpent. He curses the serpent. And he says, from now on, you'll be on your belly, you'll eat dust. And that means that you are humiliated. It's a reference to humiliation. he is as low as he can go. But then in verse 15, he says this. It says, this is God, will put enmity between you and the woman. He says, and between your offspring and hers. And he will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. And that's so enigmatic. Now, don't run ahead of me. So here's this glimmer of hope here. Humans cannot undo what they've done. They've unleashed something that, it's like Pandora's box or whatever has been open, and mayhem and chaos emerges, and now things go south, things go sour. But God says, if anything's going to be done, it has to be God. So God says, I'm going to do this. He says, I will put enmity between you and the woman. There's not going to be any getting along in between your seed and her seed, and in the end, there's going to be a final match, if you will. He will crush your head and you will strike his heel, whatever that means. So here's a new concept, enmity. A new reality that will be an ever-increasing plague in our world. But there is the promise here. And so this word enmity is a word that describes movement from order to disorder. It describes from peace to violence, from unity to disunity, from togetherness to separation. And so God then talks about the consequences. So now not only the serpent cursed, there's two things that are cursed, the serpent and the ground. Creation is cursed. Creation is cursed. And so he tells Eve, so raising a family is going to be very painful experience. All right? Raising a family is going to be a very painful experience. To the man, he says, and, finding food and feeding a family is going to be a painful experience. The ground will no longer cooperate in giving up its fruitfulness. So it's competition is the name of the game now, not cooperation. Blood, sweat, and tears are the new normal. Relationships are just, it's not going to work out. Nothing's going to work out. So God then expels the humans from the garden. He exiles them. He exiles them away from the source of life, security, and peace, out into a world of woe that they've brought about themselves. So the humans are going to go build a world. They are going to build a world, but it's not going to be the kind of world God intended. All we need to do is read chapter 4 through chapter 11 to see how humans intend to build their world. We come to chapter 4, Cain and Abel. What happens? A murder right here at the beginning. And then God says in verse 16, Cain went away from the presence of the Lord. So we have another exile. And then Cain has descendants reading on in chapter 17. Cain builds a city, names it after a son. Civilization begins to happen, emerge, but this civilization is built on violence because one of his descendants, Lamech, says, if Cain was avenged 7 times, I will be avenged 77 times to the nth degree. So we have a world full of violence. We see that. And things go from worse to worser. I know that's not a proper English word, but I read actually it's an old, archaic English word. Yeah, worse to worser. So I knew it goes from worse to worser, leading to a decreation of the world in the flood. And God starts again. And so Noah emerged from the flood as a new Adam. But then he repeats the same thing, because in that story, at the end, he builds a garden, a vineyard, and he drinks from it, and he gets drunk, and he's naked, and so we have the story repeated again. So this new Adam is like the old Adam. And another city is built, and a tower in chapter 11, and they're trying to make a name for themselves. God said earlier, be fruitful and fill the earth, and they're all in one here. And so they try to make a name for themselves, and God will have none of it. And so this is how humanity goes about building a world. It's the template. It's human's template, not God's. It's seeing and taking, seeing and taking, seeing and taking, rejecting God's wisdom, replacing it with our own wisdom, because we know better. We know better. We have built a world now that is filled with exploitation, greed, violence. Yeah, the wider world, but we don't have to go very far to see that in our own hearts, our own lives. We have redefined good and evil. That's how we've built our world. In popular Christian culture, this story is called the fall. The fall. Well, because, humans disobeyed and they fell from grace. But this story actually is not just a fall from grace. It's much worse than that. This is a rebellion. This is a rebellion because humans have rebelled against God's wisdom, God's ways. This story is a failure to launch. God intended for humans as his partners to build a world, and now humans cannot do this. They cannot do this. Yeah, we try and build a world, but it's everything just disintegrates and falls apart. So this original intention by God, this creation project we've said, has been derailed. And so the story of the Bible, I believe, is a story of how God will get his creation project back on track again. It takes turns and twists. And so God is not just seeking a restoration of his relationship with us. That is true. He is seeking our partnership again so that we can fulfill his original purpose, his original intention for creation. But to do that, God must defeat chaos or defeat evil at its source, not just in our hearts. It needs to be defeated in our hearts, but he needs to defeat it at its source. That word defeat suggests a battle, fighting, something, striking heels, crushing heads of serpents, that kind of thing. So we have a glimpse of this in chapter 3, verse 15. And so I believe Genesis 3 is much worse than humans just disobeying a command of God, just resulting in a severed relationship. So the story is about restoring this relationship. Yes, it does mean that, but it goes much deeper. The problem is much deeper. It's not just a story of a lost relationship, but a story of lost vocation. We cannot fulfill God's intention for us as human beings. We're not truly human any longer, as God defines that back in chapter 1. We're not truly human. Chaos and evil must be ultimately defeated, not just from our personal lives, but from the whole creation. We've made our choice. Yes, our forebears have made the choice for us, but we've made our choice too. We've followed in their footsteps to build our lives, to build our communities, to build our institutions, our world on the wisdom of seeing and taking. So that's how we've done it. We've redefined good and evil. We've said now what good is pointing to us. Evil is pointing to the other. We have said good is to be served because I deserve it. The evil is to serve. Good is to promote me or us and our agenda and our ways. And evil is for us to be demoted for the sake of the other. We've said that good is darkness, evil is light. We've redefined it. So as we look around, we see a world built on exploitation, greed, and violence, and not just these things, but we see a world, and a world filled with pain and sorrow and hurt of all kinds, loneliness and fear. But we know there's hope. We know the story. We're just here in chapter 3, but we know the end of the story. We know that ultimately, we know this, that the seed of the woman, he does defeat chaos at its source. I mean, we read Revelation chapter 12. Revelation chapter 12, we have the story of this great red dragon, the serpent, who is huge and evil and represents chaos and all of that. And there was this woman about to give birth to this seed, this man-child, and so he's there, right there, and she's about to give birth. He's ready to devour this child, but somehow before he can devour the child that was born, it's snatched up in heaven. And so the dragon goes after him up there, and he gets thrown to the earth. And this vision here, this vision is about, it's sort of is a phrase we overuse. It doesn't mean anything, sort of. It's a retelling of Genesis chapter 3, Revelation 12. But we know in the end that Jesus, he does defeat. Yes, he does. We do know this. But even in the midst of our painful, suffering world, we who have embraced the dragon slayer, we know we're promised a future with God without chaos, without evil, without this dragon serpent. But we're getting way ahead of the story here. This is our story. So, Genesis 3:15 is the light in this dark story. He talks about enmity between, not only between the serpent and the woman, but between his seed. Who are the seed of the serpent? Was those who lives life the ways of the serpent. Now Jesus, in John chapter 8, he's talking with the Jewish leaders, and Jesus gives his interpretation on Genesis chapter 3, because he says to these Jewish leaders who are opposing God by opposing him, thwarting God's plans for fulfilling his creation purposes and all that, he says, you're just like your father, the devil. They're the seed of the serpent. And he's the father of lies. So from the beginning. So those who follow the ways of the serpent are the seed. So that we have a choice. We have a choice. Every day it's our choice, I guess, to be this. Are we going to be the seed of the serpent, or are we going to be the seed of the woman? So we're going to go out into the world with clenched fists, seeing and taking, or with open palms, seeing and giving. So that's the choice we make every day. It says Jesus went about doing good and healing all those who were oppressed by the devil. Jesus lived his life open palms. Jesus is really the new human that's going to get God's creation project back on track. He went about doing good, blessing others, doing it God's way, healing all those who are oppressed by the devil. And we're told in Galatians 3, do good to all people. Do good to all people. And when we do good to all people, we're defeating evil. We're being the seed of the woman. Paul writes in Romans 12:21, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. There's that phrase, good and evil. So in the end, good is more powerful than evil. So do not be overcome by evil, but in your response in your life and how you live your life when you go out of your house each day into the world of woe, is it with clenched fist or open palms? Be overcome evil with good. And there's all kinds of stories that we can tell to illustrate this. Let me just share with one story here. Several years ago, many of you know the story. We had a student at the Bible College, Sinai, from Papua New Guinea. Sinai always shopped at New World, that wonderful supermarket down that way, somewhere down that way. Doesn't matter, does it? One day she shopped, she went home, and then the next time she went back, she was barred from going into the store because she was accused of shoplifting. They had it on camera. They had the surveillance camera. It showed it right there. And that just devastated her because she says, I didn't shoplift. I didn't steal from the store. But they were insistent on that. Well, to make a longer story short, Mary got involved. All right. Mary's tenacious. And so Mary said, we're going to get to the bottom of this one way or the other. And so she kept at it. And so she ended up speaking to the manager and saying, and no one would show the videotape. They said, I said, could I see it? No. At first Mary said, could we see it? No. Finally, she convinced the manager to go look at it. Go look at it. And so he did, and he says, you know what? She didn't steal. We were wrong. We're sorry. He wrote a letter of apology, and he apologized in person to Sinai. So she was allowed back. That's defeating evil. That's overcoming evil with good. That is advocating for justice when there is injustice. And so there's all kinds of ways we can be in this world. So last week I said, when you get up in the morning, so here's the takeaway from today, I guess. Look yourself in the mirror, and you tell yourself who you are. You are God's royal image bearers. And then go out into the world and be that. And be that. Today, now you can add to this, when you're telling yourself, I am God's royal image bearer, tell yourself, how am I going to go out into the world of woe today? I'm going to go out seeing and taking for myself and just contributing to the evil in this world, or am I going to go out with open palm to give? So it's either this or this. So yeah, you can do that in front of the mirror. Am I going to do this? Is this going to be my choice, like Eve, or this, or this? So how do we get from Genesis 3 to the cross? Well, Noah didn't, he was a new Adam, now that didn't work, so God's going to choose a new Adam, Abraham, and his family, and it's his family that God will use to undo what was done back in the garden. But that's for the next weeks down the road. God will get his creation project back on track. Remember this, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom.